Hi, welcome again to another question of the day at MCATselfprep.com. Today we're going to be walking through one of the many free questions found on our free e-course. And my name is Theo Bennett. I'm one of the tutors here at MCAT Self Prep, and I actually used the free e-course to get a perfect 528 on the MCAT. And so today I'm going to be walking you through this question as though you were one of my private tutoring students. So let's go ahead and dive in, but before we do, feel free to press pause and try this question out for yourself. Okay, great. So today's question comes from Enzyme Kinetics, which is lesson 3 of the Biochemistry 1 module. And it really has to do a lot with the different electrolytic versus voltaic cells. Here we're seeing that we have proteins that are migrating, and we need to figure out if they're migrating towards the anode or the cathode, or potentially both. So let's go ahead and jump into the explanation. So whenever we are explained, or at least how I was initially explained, the difference between voltaic and electrolytic cells, physics professors, or at least my physics professor, did this in a terrible way. It was counterintuitive, and because they set it up in this incorrect way, it made it so much more difficult for me to comprehend. So this is how they set it up, right? They've got one metal on one side, and then it's going to naturally flow over to the other metal due to the differences in their reduction potentials. And doing so, we have an anode and a cathode. But then, to jump over to electrolytic cells, what they do is to keep the electrons flowing in the same direction, they have to switch the metals. But this is actually the opposite of what's really happening here. And let me go ahead and explain this with a better picture then. Okay, so this is a much better picture now. Here, again, we're dealing with galvanic or voltaic cells and electrolytic cells. Galvanic cells happen naturally, just due to the differences in reduction potentials between two different metals. And so one metal essentially is more willing to give up their electrons, and the other metal really wants to accept those electrons over here. And so we can think of these as a negative and a positive terminal. The negative terminal is going to be a terminal that is the source of electrons, right? So it's like overflowing with negative charge, and this positive terminal really wants those negative charges. Again, opposite charges attracting. And so once we know this flow of electrons, again, we have to think about oil rig, right? So oxidation is losing and reduction is gaining. So on this side over here, we're gaining electrons, and that makes sense that the positive terminal wants to gain those electrons. And then once we understand the difference between reduction and oxidation, we now need to convert that to anode and cathode, right? And the mnemonic that most people use is an-ox and red-cat, right? So if I'm being reduced, this is going to happen at the cathode. And that's going to happen at the cathode regardless of whether we're dealing with galvanic or electrolytic cells. The only difference now here when we come to an electrolytic cell is this needs to be plugged in, right? We've got this power source that's essentially pushing electrons against their sort of concentration gradient, if you will. It's not really a concentration gradient, but it's using energy to reverse the flow of what wants to happen naturally. And so here now we have electrons that are flowing in this direction, which again, at the cathode, right, red cat, it's still being reduced, it's still receiving the electrons, but here the negative terminal now is receiving those electrons. And so essentially, all that's happened is we've reversed the flow of electrons. This negative and positive just is intrinsic to the metals themselves, right? It basically designates which side is more willing to give up its electrons, which side wants to accept those electrons. And so this silvery metal still wants to give up the electrons, but here we're forcing it to accept it. So basically, the switch here, and how physics teachers explain it is, oh, everything changes, you know, like what's being reduced and what's being oxidized changes. But really, all we need to understand is the flow of electrons switches, but these negative and positive terminals stay the same. And so now we're reducing at the negative terminal, and so therefore the cathode is at the negative terminal. Again, all of this makes sense if you just understand that the electrons switch directions, but the negative and positive stays the same. So now let's use this new information and go back and answer the question. Okay, so now you're going to need to follow me here because this is a little bit complicated to explain, but if we can explain it from these first principles, you'll be able to get every single voltaic cell question. Okay, so essentially the question is asking that whether which direction proteins that are positively charged will flow to. So the thing that you need to understand is proteins that are positively charged will always flow towards the negative terminal. But in this case, we need to think about which direction the electrons are flowing. Are they flowing towards the negative terminal or towards the positive terminal, right? If this was a normal voltaic cell, those electrons would want to flow towards the positive terminal, right? Because that's just their natural tendency to go to the opposite charge. But in this case, this is something that we have to plug in, right? This is an isoelectric focusing machine that needs to be plugged in. And so instead of our natural voltaic cell, we're actually dealing with now an electrolytic cell. And so now the electrons are actually, it's that situation where, again, they're going to flow in the opposite direction towards the negative terminal. Okay, so knowing that now our electrons are flowing towards the negative terminal, that means that negative terminal is gaining electrons, right? Reduction is gaining. And so the negative terminal is being reduced. And because it's being reduced, remember our anox and red cat analogy? So it's being reduced, so that means it's going to be the cathode. And so this means that the proteins that are positively charged want to flow to the negative terminal, and the negative terminal is gaining electrons because it's an electrolytic cell. And because it's gaining electrons, that means it's being reduced. And because it's being reduced, that means it's the cathode, right? Okay, so that was a lot. This question is actually pretty difficult. But for the negative proteins, negatively charged proteins, it's just going to be the opposite. So we'll choose this first answer. Perfect. If you like this video, feel free to give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you love it. And we're going to be releasing a lot more of these videos. So if you're also interested, you can check out our free e-course, MCATselfprep.com. We're really just committed to giving as many free resources to students so that they can succeed on the MCAT.